Everybody, I'm Danny Horn, and thank you so much. And my talk today is called Flying Saucers and the Truth That Isn't Out There. So here's the thing that didn't happen. Summer 1947, night. Streak of light flashes across the New Mexico sky. It's either June 12th, July 2nd, or July 4th, depending on who's telling the story, and an interplanetary spacecraft piloted by galactic moon men is having some kind of engine trouble. Some people say it was struck by lightning, because, as you know, machines that are designed to pilot between the stars have no defense against Earth lightning. So stuff just started falling out the back. Other people say it was a mechanical malfunction, or maybe the aliens just some mysterious alien reason of their own. Either way, it crashed. It came down on a ranch about 75 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico. Or possibly it landed on the ranch, then got back in the air, and then crashed again 3 miles away. Or some people say just some debris landed on the ranch, and then the saucer crashed 200 miles away in the desert of San Augustine. It's possible there were actually two separate spaceships that crashed at the same time, which for the aliens would be like super embarrassing. But the debris, that's the important thing. The stuff that was left on the ranch included magic tinfoil that couldn't be crushed, burned, or otherwise destroyed, and some sticks that were decorated with mysterious pink and purple hieroglyphics that might represent an alien language. Meanwhile, 10 years later, a saucer was found out in the desert by a civil engineer and a team of imaginary archaeology students. They found either 4, 6, or 8 aliens, 2 of which survived and went into federal custody. The aliens were roughly humanoid, but they were bald, they had one-piece gray flight suits, and they only had 4 fingers on each hand. Military police cordoned off the area and collected all the alien parts, and they brought it to either Roswell Airfield or Edwards Airfield, maybe Holloman, maybe Andrews Field, possibly all of the above. And the alien corpses were sent by a special cargo plane to show them to President Eisenhower, who was not president at that time, because he was curious about what they looked like. The guy who found the debris was arrested, kept in custody for a week, and ordered never to tell anybody about what he saw, an order which he promptly violated. And in fact, more than 100 eyewitnesses to the Roswell event were instructed never to tell anybody about what they saw, or they would be imprisoned or killed. But turns out later they all talked about it anyway, and everyone is basically fine. Now, this is not my story. These are the legends that our people tell. This is the myth of Roswell. In tons of books and movies and basic cable TV shows for the last 30 years. But what actually happened in Roswell in 1947 was over in 2 days and was not a big deal at all. Here's what really happened. June 14th, 1947, on the J.B. Foster Ranch, about 75 miles north of Roswell, a foreman named Mac Brazel found a bunch of stuff just lying around in a field. It wasn't really an unidentified flying object as much as an unidentified lying around on the ground object, so he didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Came back a couple weeks later to gather up some of this junk. Did pieces of rubber, paper, tinfoil, scotch tape, and sticks. The whole thing would fit on a small tabletop, and it weighed about 5 pounds. He brought it home, and a neighbor told him that it might be one of those flying saucers that he'd heard about. So on Monday, Brazel went into town, told the sheriff what he found, and the sheriff put him in touch with Major Jesse Marcel at the Roswell Army Airfield. Major Marcel was an intelligence officer. He and Captain Sheridan Cavett then went to the ranch to collect some more of the material and bring it back to the airbase. Captain Cavett thought it looked like a crashed weather balloon, which is a thing that's launched regularly to take atmospheric readings on temperature and wind speed. But Major Marcel said that he knew what a weather balloon looked like, and this wasn't a weather balloon, so it must be an alien spacecraft. So early the next morning, they issued a press release that said that they were now in possession of a flying saucer. And this was an extremely trendy thing for them to say, because the whole concept of flying saucer was just invented a few weeks earlier. So I'm just going to skip back for a minute, 3 weeks, back to where all of this flying saucer stuff started. Began on June 24th with a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who was flying in his plane about south of Seattle, about 25 miles away from Mount Rainier, and he looked out his window and found, he saw a string of 9 disc-shaped objects that were flying around, weaving in and out between the mountain peaks. and they were skipping along the air like a saucer skips across water. So this is what he saw. There were 9 spaceships, which he estimated were 50 feet long. He knew that Mount Rainier was 25 miles away, so he marked their position and timed it, and found that they were flying about 1,700 miles an hour, which is 4 times faster than a jet. Somehow this ended up in the newspaper and became national news right away. People believed Kenneth Arnold because he was a respected businessman and an experienced pilot, and he said a bunch of numbers, so it sounded like he knew what he was talking about. Kenneth Arnold actually became kind of famous, or at least as famous as you can get just for looking at something. And basically everything that anyone else has ever said about flying saucers was just Kenneth Arnold fan fiction. The newspapers weren't sure what to call these objects, so they tried out a few options, including flying discs and flying pie pans. And here's one that really didn't catch on: whiz planes, on which Army experts were apparently skeptical. And I don't blame them. I'm kind of skeptical on whiz planes myself. Within a few days, the newspapers kind of settled on either flying saucers or flying discs, but the one thing that everyone could agree on was that they were everywhere. As soon as the story broke, people went outside, looked up in the sky, and if they saw something they could not immediately identify, now they had a word for it. So all of that kind of took place over a few weeks, with the craze peaking on the July 4th weekend, and that is the week that Mac Brazel took his stuff to the Roswell Army Airfield. So that's why they got so excited, was that here was the answer to the mystery of the flying pie pans. So after they issued the press release, Marcel took the stuff and flew to Fort Worth to show it to General Roger Ramey. And Ramey kind of spread it out and looked at it and said, "Yeah, this looks to me like a crashed weather balloon." So they brought in Weather Officer Irving Newton, who came in and laughed and said, "Wait, this is your flying saucer?" Just to illustrate what a weird experience that was for Newton, this is a quote from a statement that he made in 1994. "While I was examining the debris, Major Marcel was picking up pieces of the target sticks and trying to convince me that some notations on the sticks were alien writings. There were figures on the sticks, lavender or pink in color, appeared to be weather-faded markings with no rhyme or reason. He did not convince me that these were alien writings." So the next day they issued another press release that said, "Nope, this was just a crashed weather balloon." And then they took all that junk and they threw it away, and everybody forgot about it. Nobody even mentioned it again for the next 30 years. So that's it. That was Roswell. No crash, no saucer, no bodies. Whole thing was over in 2 days. But there are a lot of people who sincerely believe that alien bodies were taken out of the desert in San Augustine. It's actually on U-Hauls, society U-Hauls that people drive all around the country. So my question is, why do people believe in things that are obviously not true? And specifically, why fixate on something that isn't true from 1947? This is the story that I will tell you. During this talk, I'm going to flag some of the common mistakes that people make when they think about flying saucers. So here's mistake number 1. Experienced pilots are always right. This is the curious idea that experienced pilots can identify absolutely anything that's in the air, even if it's unusual. So an Air Force pilot says that they see something that they specifically say they cannot identify, and so you ask them to make a guess, and then whatever they say, you treat it as 100% accurate. I don't believe any successful military runs on that principle. It turns out that there is an upper limit on human sensory perception, and you do not exceed it by joining the Air Force. And that was the problem with Kenneth Arnold and his string of saucers flying around Mount Rainier. People believed him because he had these numbers, but the numbers don't make sense. He said that the spaceships were 50 feet long and 25 miles away. But you can't actually, the human eye cannot distinguish something that size from that distance. So here's a fun fact about math. If you don't know how big something is, you can't tell how far away it is. And then you can't calculate how fast it's moving, especially if it doesn't exist. But the Air Force was concerned about it, and rightly so. If there's something unusual in the air, then they want to know what's going on. So in 1948, they established a program called Project Sign that was supposed to get to the bottom of things. There were 3 incidents in 1948 that were well publicized, and these are called the classics. They're the 3 incidents that convinced Project Sign that flying saucers were real. In January, there was the Mantell incident. In July, the Charles Whitted sighting, and then in October, the Gorman dogfight. Let's take a look. Mantell incident was January 7th, 1948, at the Godman Army Airfield near Fort Knox, Kentucky. At 1:45 p.m., a highway patrolman called the airbase and said that he saw a flaming red cone hanging in the sky. And in the control tower, they could verify the sighting, so they called 3 fighter pilots that were currently in the air, asked them to approach and investigate. It was actually a skyhook balloon, is what it was. This was a brand new balloon that was used for research. They would launch it 30,000 feet into the stratosphere carrying research equipment. The folks at the airfield weren't familiar with it because skyhook balloons were actually top secret classified until 1949. So here's these 3 fighters that are trying to approach it at 30,000 feet. When they get up to 22,000 feet, 2 of the pilots peel off because there's a lack of oxygen at that altitude. But Captain Thomas Mantell, who, as you can see, was an experienced Air Force pilot, kept on climbing. He got real excited and tried to get as close to it as he could. When he got to 25,000 feet, he passed out from lack of oxygen, and his plane crashed and killed him. So now it's getting really serious. The flying saucers actually killed somebody. The Air Force, official Air Force explanation was that it was Venus, and that was visible in the sky, but it didn't really fit the facts, and people got suspicious because Mantell was an experienced pilot. Why would he kill himself trying to reach Venus? So that's Mantell. Here in July 24th, 1948, that's the Childs Whitted sighting. 2:45 in the morning in the skies over Montgomery, Alabama. There were 2 Eastern Airlines pilots named Clarence Childs and John Whitted. And they're flying along and they see a really bright glow heading towards them. And then it flashed past their airplane and disappeared into the clouds. The whole thing took about 10 seconds. Once they got to the ground, they drew these pictures of what they thought the object looked like. They said it was torpedo or cigar-shaped. Childs said that he saw a lighted cockpit in the front. Whitted didn't see a cockpit, but he said that there was a line of rectangular windows going down the side. It was actually just an unusually bright meteor, which is really common in late July, but not necessarily at that altitude. The pilots were just startled and misinterpreted what they saw, like people do. But at Project Sign, they were really excited because here are 2 experienced pilots who got a close look at a flying saucer. Now, you'll notice that Kenneth Arnold's flying saucer was disc-shaped, Mantell's was a big red cone, and now Childs and Whitted saw something that was torpedo-shaped. The fact that they all looked completely different did not seem to bother anybody at the time. So here's the final one, the Gorman dogfight. This was October 1st, 1948, skies over Fargo, North Dakota. George Gorman, who was a pilot with the North Dakota Air National Guard, was flying along, and he saw a ball of light ahead of him. The control tower said that there wasn't any air traffic there, so he went close to try and investigate. Once he got there, the ball of light flew over his plane. And when he managed to turn around and get a look at it, it had made a 180-degree turn and was coming straight at him, and then made a sudden vertical climb up. He actually ended up fighting with this for 25 minutes. It is not clear what he would do with it if he caught it. So they just kind of spent a lot of time flying around each other. And this is the diagram that he made when they got to the ground. It was a weather balloon. It was just lighted up, and basically the exciting tactical moves that he thought it was making, that was just his own plane flying around, just because he thought this thing was bigger and heavier and more solid than it actually was. Actually, towards the end of the fight, he lost sight of it, and for the last bit, you can see he just started following Jupiter for a while. Once he got to the ground, folks from Project Sign ran up with Geiger counters and tested his plane for radioactivity. I have no idea where they got that idea. So they tested the plane and compared it to another plane that hadn't been flying for a few days and found that Gorman's plane was more radioactive. And so that was very exciting because it means that Gorman's imaginary flying saucer was atomic powered, which imaginarily would be very dangerous. Later on, they figured out that a plane that spent a lot of time up in the air is less shielded from radiation, so they kind of figured out later that wasn't actually a big deal. But with these 3 amazing stories in their pocket, folks at Project Sign wrote a document in 1949 called an Estimate of the Situation, where they said experienced pilots are always right, and therefore flying saucers are alien spacecraft. So that Estimate of the Situation document followed up the chain of command at the Air Force until it reached General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force Chief of Staff. Vandenberg, who was skeptical on whiz planes, said that this was nonsense and just rejected the report. He said, you don't actually have any real evidence. These are just momentary sightings that leave nothing behind. We've been investigating this for 2 years, and we haven't actually learned anything. So in 1949, they dissolved Project Sign, and they started a new program called Project Grudge. And the mission of Project Grudge was just to get people to stop paying attention to flying saucer reports. One of the things that they did in 1949 was to sponsor an article in the Saturday Evening Post, which is a very popular magazine, called What You Can Believe About Flying Saucers. And in it, they were trying to tell America that there was nothing real here, but unfortunately, the article, sort of in order to make that point, just described a whole bunch of flying saucer sightings, and they couldn't explain some of them, so people weren't necessarily convinced. So along comes Donald Kehoe in 1950, who is one of the most aggravating people who ever lived. Kehoe was an aviator with the Marine Corps and then became a freelance writer, mostly writing articles about planes for magazines and also stories for science fiction magazines. And he appointed himself the person who was going to get to the bottom of all this. In January 1950, Kehoe wrote an article for True magazine, also popular at the time, called The Flying Saucers Are Real. And in it, he kind of went into all the classics, and this is how that article started. After 8 months of intensive investigation, the following conclusions have been reached by True magazine. 1. For the past 175 years, the planet Earth has been under systematic close-range examination by living, intelligent observers from another planet, period. 2. The intensity of this observation and the frequency of the visits have increased markedly during the past 2 years, period. That's the first 3 sentences of that article. It just got more exciting from there. Going through all the classics, he said that Mantell was too experienced to kill himself from lack of oxygen. Childs and Whitted were too experienced to misidentify a meteor, blah, 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 experienced pilot stuff. The article was a big hit and convinced a lot of people, so in June, he published a whole book, also called The Flying Saucers Are Real. And a big point in the book was looking at the contradictory statements that the Air Force had made over the past few years. Like, first they said they were interested in flying saucers, then they said they weren't. What's going on? So here's what he wrote. All I learned was that the Air Force seemed divided, but that could be a smokescreen. I believe that the Air Force statements, contradictory as they appear, are part of an intricate program to prepare America and the world for the secret of the discs. So, this brings us to mistake number 2, which is the Air Force is one thing. Like, people talked about, what did the Air Force believe or the Air Force didn't believe. There's no such thing as the Air Force. There's just individual people who work for the Air Force, and sometimes they disagree, or they change their minds, or they investigate something and then stop. So, Donald Kehoe says, like, why, the Air Force said this, and then a year later, the Air Force said that, and, why are you contradicting yourself? And they just say, like, well, we're 2 different people, actually. We've got our names printed right here. That's so people can tell us apart. Another thing that he was talking about in The Flying Saucers Are Real, this was an incident that he talked about where somebody in the Navy said one thing and then somebody in the Air Force said something else. Why was McLaughlin, a regular Navy officer subject to security screening, permitted to give out this story? Was it an incredible slip-up, or was it part of some carefully thought-out plan? The official explanation may be imminent. When it is finally revealed, I believe the elaborate preparation, even the wide deceit involved, will be fully justified in the minds of the American people. Okay, thank you, Donald. Thank you very much. You are so aggravating. Like, actually what was going on was there's just nothing top secret here, and so the armed forces weren't coordinating with each other, keep a lid on anything. Totally fine. The Navy says one thing, somebody from the Air Force says something else. But Kehoe said it was all part of a coordinated master plan. And the thing that's so aggravating about this is that once you have that umbrella idea, it's completely non-falsifiable. Somebody says flying saucers are real, somebody says that they're not, and no matter what happens, Kehoe for the rest of his life could just say, aha, so I was right. Meanwhile, in 1950, people are still looking up at the sky. Farmington, New Mexico on St. Patrick's Day, there was a whole fleet of flying saucers that passed overhead that everybody could see. There were hundreds of them, just like floating around in what seemed like random patterns, crisscrossing with each other. And like it wasn't just a couple of people, it was the whole town. As you can see in the article, the witnesses, including businessmen and private pilots, because it's always about the pilots with these people, like everybody saw it. This was a skyhook balloon, again. Basically, it goes up really high, and when it gets icy, the balloons can freeze and then shatter. And so then there's all these little strips of reflective rubber fluttering down from the upper atmosphere. But people in Farmington are looking up. They see all this going on. They're hyped to see flying saucers, so what they see is flying saucers. And then people read these newspaper articles. They don't know the actual answer for it. Nobody did it in that moment. So people read about this stuff and say, how can they still deny that something's going on? So there's another book from 1950 that we have to discuss. It's called Is Another World Watching? The Riddle of the Flying Saucers by Gerald Hurd. Like Donald Kehoe, Hurd was reading all the stories in the newspaper, combining it with his own imagination, and then announcing to the world that he understands what's happening. In this case, the big clue that he was really stuck on is like the speed and the acceleration observed in stuff like the Gorman dogfight and other sightings like that. So here's what he said. There were two acute problems raised by the flight of the saucers. The first was the tremendous speed, 18,000 miles per hour, and on top of that, and even more serious, the tremendous acceleration. In short, nothing larger than an insect, say a bee, could stand that sheer push and not literally be pushed out of life. So, nothing larger than an insect, say a bee. So this is what Gerald Hurd wrote, was that these are hyperintelligent bees from Mars that have gotten into their flying saucers and visiting the Earth to spy on us because they're wondering why we don't live in hives. The logic, which he goes on at great length about, is that only an insect could stand these G-forces, and bees are the insects that have the best communication skills. If our bees have a form, it makes sense, right? If our bees have a form of rational communication, might that not prove of immense use to us? They might be able to act as invaluable translators and interpreters when and if bees of a still more advanced breed swarmed upon us. So this is the whole point of this book, is that we all need to learn bee language as fast as we can so that the Earth bees can translate for us when the Martian bees come. And the thing that's actually weird about it is this is not any different from what anybody else was saying at the time. Everybody was just like reading the newspaper and taking these little scraps of mistakes and misinformation and turning it into some kind of crazy. But clearly the flying saucer reports weren't going away. So in 1952, some Air Force generals were unsatisfied with kind of this unclear situation. So they canceled Project Grudge, started a new program called Project Blue Book, which was really supposed to be neutral and factual, just get to the bottom of things. Project Blue Book was headed by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. And the really good thing about Ruppelt was that he was scrupulously honest and fair. He said, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, didn't waste time speculating about hyperintelligent bees. Ruppelt is the person who actually coined the phrase unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, which is a more neutral term that doesn't make any claims about what the object actually is. Although the problem with that term is it does imply that there's an actual solid object and it's not like a planet or just a blip on the radar or a flaw in a film negative. So over time, the term UFO basically just drifted until it just means the same thing as flying saucer. But it was a good time to have somebody sensible in charge of flying saucer reports, because in July 1952, there was the great Washington, D.C. flying saucer scare. This started on Saturday, July 19th around midnight, when a radar operator at Washington National Airport saw a bunch of weird things on the radar. They were acting in a really peculiar way. There was no air traffic around there, and they were sort of poking along slowly and then suddenly speeding up. So they called other radar operators and said, do you see anything weird? And they said, yeah, we're picking up something too. So they started to radio pilots and say, hey, do you see any unusual lights in the sky? Some of them said yes, some of them said no, and that turned out to be an invigorating evening for everybody. That begins the Great Flying Saucer Scare of 1952, which got in all the newspapers and lasted for 2 weeks. This incident demonstrates that when you create a high-stress environment, when saucer reports are acceptable, lots of people see flying saucers. In the modern world, there's a lot of stuff that produces and reflects light, but you don't point at every light that you see and say, hey, that's a flying saucer, because you'd look silly. But if it's late in the night and you believe that the White House is under attack from random lights in the sky, then it is not just acceptable to make a flying saucer report, it is a matter of urgent national security. So everybody says, hey, I think I see something over there. And if there's a blip on the radar in that direction, all of a sudden that's super exciting. It turns out that there's actually a thing called temperature inversion, which is when there's a layer of warm, dry air that is sitting on top of a layer of cool, denser, moist air, and that creates a lot of false radar pings. People said that the radar operators were too experienced to make that mistake, but you'll notice everybody gets super experienced like a minute and a half before they make a flying saucer report. Next weekend, it happened again. They saw more stuff on the radar, and so they scrambled fighter jets to go and actually look at these objects. But when they got there, turns out they had magically flown away. There was nothing there, because obviously they weren't real. But this is when the CIA started to get worried about it. The CIA actually wasn't concerned about a saucer invasion. They were worried about the panic, because they thought if an enemy nation floods the US with these false flying saucer reports, everyone gets excited, pays attention to that, and then they can launch a sneak attack. So they recommended that they get an expert panel who would look at all of the reports from Project Blue Book and kind of make some kind of final conclusion on this. So in January 1953, they convened a panel that was called the Robertson Panel, which was headed by Harold P. Robertson, who was a physicist and a CIA consultant and the director of the Defense Department Weapons Evaluation Group. The other members were astrophysicists and radar experts and other CIA consultants. Edward Ruppelt presented all of the stuff that they had from Project Blue Book. They had analyzed by that point almost 1,600 flying saucer reports, and they broke it down into these useful categories like balloons, aircraft, astronomical bodies, clouds, birds, and reflections, 4.2%, hoaxes, insufficient data, and unknowns, 26.9%. And that was the thing that they really wanted us to get excited about, was that after all of this time, they still didn't know 26.9% of what they were talking about. Like I said, Ruppelt was very fair, and Blue Book was trying to be as accurate as they could be. But the problem with splitting things up into these categories of known and unknown, that means the unknown has this special status that it absolutely does not deserve. What they should have said was alien spacecraft, 0.0%. But they didn't, and so people get stuck on like, well, but what about all these unknowns? Flying saucer investigation is the only science where success is measured by the things that you don't learn. And so they had to admit that of all those Project Blue Book unknowns, there was no significant patterns in size, color, shape, direction they were traveling, time of day. They knew that there were more flying saucer reports in mid-July and just before Christmas, but nobody knew why. There was no reliable estimate of speed or altitude. Basically, there was no physical evidence, absolutely at all. The only thing that they had were these two movies, the Montana movie and the Tremonton movie. These are just little film clips of saucer sightings. And Project Blue Book considered these to be the positive proof. If the Robertson Panel was going to be impressed by anything, it was going to be these two movies. This is a shot from the Montana movie. It was filmed in Great Falls, Montana in 1950. It's 12 seconds long. If you can't see anything in the back, don't worry about it. There is nothing to see. It is just these two little white dots that go from here to over there. And that's pretty much it. The panel concluded that it was just reflections off two F-94s, which is a new jet aircraft that they developed in 1950. This is the Tremonton movie, filmed in Tremonton, Utah in 1952, 45 seconds long, even more exciting, because look, we got this, and then at one point, this. They were birds, is what they were. Like, I feel like I could see wings flapping. It is not super compelling, and the Robertson Panel was not compelled by it. The panel had a lot to say, but this was their main point. Attention should be directed to the requirement among scientists that a new phenomena, to be accepted, must be completely and convincingly documented. In other words, the burden of proof is on the citer, not the explainer. Because, if we discover that there is life on other planets, that would be one of the most important discoveries in all of human history. And if that life actually came all the way from the stars to us on Earth, that would be a civilization-changing event. But if people can't tell the difference between your monumental scientific discovery and birds, you're gonna have to go away and come back when you got a better movie. Like, I'm sorry, but that's just the way that works. So the Robertson panel said that the Air Force, once again, should just forget about flying saucers. Ruppelt resigned from Project Blue Book and retired from the Air Force. Blue Book just kind of kept stumbling along for another 16 years and finally ended in 1969, having achieved nothing of significance. But here comes Donald Kehoe again. In 1953, he has a second book called Flying Saucers from Outer Space. Now, if you recall, 3 years ago in his first book, he actually had a really optimistic view. He was expecting an imminent announcement that would make everything clear. It's now 3 years later, and now the Air Force has started investigating, stopped again, started again, and then stopped again. So he's trying to figure out what's going on, and this book has kind of a lot darker outlook. It was a curious situation. The officers and civilian officials involved in UFO policy decisions were divided roughly into 3 main groups. The first, which I'll call Group A, believed that sighting reports should be made public to prepare the country. Most of the men in this group had seen all the evidence and were convinced the saucers were machines superior to any known aircraft. The other 2 groups believed in silence, but for different reasons. Those in the B group also had seen the evidence, believed the saucers were real, but feared the effect of a public admission. Group C was made up of hard-headed non-believers. Most of them had never troubled to examine the evidence. The few who had flatly refused to believe it. This isn't based on anything in particular, by the way. This is just kind of how things kind of came together in Donald Kehoe's brain. So the Robertson Panel's suggestion that the Air Force discourage flying saucer reports just fed this kind of paranoid idea about this stubborn and sinister silence group. And that's the pattern. 1947 to 1953, that is the cycle that kept on repeating. It goes like this. Someone sees a thing, preferably an experienced pilot if you have one. People think that it's aliens, and authority says it's probably not. And then people invent conspiracy theories, and nothing happens. Until someone sees another thing, and then they go right back to the beginning, and we start it all over again. This cycle is all there is. It just keeps repeating. This is the last 7 decades of flying saucer science. Like, no matter what happens, we have not advanced a single step since 1953. One thing that keeps this paranoid cover-up idea alive is that there actually are government cover-ups. For example, in 1955, the U-2 planes. The Russians did their first hydrogen bomb test in 1953. Americans thought maybe this was a good time to keep an eye on them. So they developed these super cool spy planes called U-2s, which could go all the way up to 60,000 feet. They were like super exciting reconnaissance planes. They were painted black. Like, I don't even like planes, but these are some badass planes. A CIA report in the 90s said that about half of the flying saucer reports from the mid-50s through the 60s were actually just U-2 planes. So when people say, like, what did the government have to hide? Why were they lying to us? The answer is, well, we didn't want the Russians to know about our super cool spy planes. Like, this is not about your little sci-fi fantasy. We're building spy planes. We're busy. Go away. Same report talked about a very peculiar incident in 1955, which kind of shaped how the CIA was going to deal with this. There were 2 elderly sisters in Chicago who recorded something off the radio that they thought was some kind of alien code. And it was written up in a flying saucer magazine. Folks in the CIA saw it, were curious what kind of code these people reported. So they sent a CIA agent to their house to talk to them and see if they could get a copy of the tape. But that agent dressed up in an Air Force uniform because they didn't want people to think that the CIA was interested in flying saucers, and that would just kind of like create more excitement about it. The agent said that, that when he got there, it was like a scene out of Arsenic and Old Lace, with these 2 elderly sisters like giving him tea and showing him scrapbooks about their days on the stage. Finally got a copy of the tape, took it back, they listened to it. Turns out it was Morse code from a US transmission that they knew about already. So they threw out the tape, forgot all about it. A couple of years later, those sisters talked to a UFO researcher who started just peppering the Air Force with questions, and then eventually the CIA, about who was this person, where did he come from, what does he work for, what was on the tape. When they said, you know what, this is just like Morse code from a US transmission, they were saying, okay, so like, what's the name of the station, what's the name of the broadcaster, what was the code? And the CIA folks said, look, we don't identify our agents, and we don't tell people about our code transmission. We're spies, is the thing. And that's just like not a thing that we do. But they kept asking questions and making a big deal about it, and after a while, the CIA's official stance on flying saucers became, oh, for fuck's sake. And I gotta say, I have never felt sympathy for the CIA before, but CIA, I feel you on this. I've been feeling that way this whole time. So, that brings us to mistake number 3, which is if you keep a secret, then you're keeping every secret. So, yeah, the CIA lied about stuff. But that doesn't mean that everything that you imagine is true. Even if the CIA isn't telling you some stuff about the spy planes, it doesn't mean they're communicating with hyperintelligent bees. But if all these flying saucer reports fall apart and nothing happens and it's just this endless cycle, why do people keep believing in them? Well, in the mid-50s, Leon Festinger, a Stanford professor of psychology, did an experiment and wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails, which sort of explains this. Festinger and his team secretly infiltrated a flying saucer doomsday cult in Oak Park, Illinois, who was prophesying the end of the world to find out what happens when that deadline went by and the world didn't end. The leader of the group was Dorothy Martin, who practiced automatic writing, which is this thing where you kind of blank out your mind and try not to pay attention, and you just let the spirits write through your hand. She had a little group of believers, and for the last year, she was in contact with a spirit named Sananda from the planet Clarion, who told her that Lake Michigan was going to flood and destroy Chicago, and then the waters would rise and destroy the whole rest of the world, and that this was going to happen on December 21st. But before that happened, Sananda would come and pick up all the members of her group in flying saucer and take them away to safety. The group actually got some news coverage in September in Chicago when they kind of first made this public announcement that that was going to happen. And then it made national news in mid-December when Charles Lofhead, who worked at Michigan State College, got fired because he was telling his students that the world was going to end on December 21st. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but the world didn't end in 1954, so that was like super disappointing. You know, their prophecy had failed. What are they going to do? But the group rallied when Martin got another message that said, okay, yes, the cataclysm has been delayed, but if this group goes outside on your front lawn on Christmas Eve and sings Christmas carols, flying saucers will come and pick you up and take you away. So a crowd gathered outside to watch them singing Christmas carols, and obviously the saucers didn't show up. So that was the second time in a week that their prophecies had failed. So you would expect after 2 embarrassing public failures, this group would fall apart, but actually the opposite happened. They believed in it even more and started proselytizing even harder. In fact, Dorothy Martin kept on preaching. After a while, she started calling herself Sister Thedra, and she kept on talking about this until the end of her life in 1992. There's still a little New Age sect that believes that Sananda is going to come and take his chosen people away in flying saucers someday. So why does this happen? Why do people continue to believe in something even after it's been proven false? To explain this, Festinger came up with this concept of cognitive dissonance, which is an awareness of the gap between what you believe and then what actually happens. And an awareness of that gap is very painful, so people do a lot of things to try and reduce that cognitive dissonance. And they found that there's 2 factors. Belief will deepen after being disproved when, first, when people have made an important life decision based on that belief and really invested in it. Like, for example, you got fired from your job and you told your job, screw you, I'm not coming back, because you were going to go and join this flying saucer cult. Or you broke off a relationship because of this belief, or you just told everybody about it, and so now everybody knows you as the person who believes that. And then, number 2, People will stay a believer if they have contact with other believers, especially shortly after the disprove. So the folks in Martin's group who lived farther away did actually say, okay, never mind, and just kind of drifted away. But the folks who were together after Christmas, they could help reinforce each other's belief and kind of help to reduce the cognitive dissonance, or at least the pain of it, just by saying, no, I still believe it true, too. So that feels good, and that's why they start to proselytize, because if it feels good to have other people agree with you, then we just need to find even more people to come and believe, and then that will actually be great. So that's why people get so weird and intense when they talk about the conspiracy theories. That's why they have to draw these complicated diagrams and then point at them really urgently. They're dealing with the cognitive dissonance that they are investing in something that nobody else believes. And so this paranoid conspiracy stuff thrives on little inconsistencies and gaps, so they go deep into the details, looking for the magic word that will make everyone else believe in it too, and then I won't be wrong anymore. So that's why folks who believe in flying saucers are still super excited about that 26.9% of unknowns in 1953. People still talk about it all these years later. When flying saucer stories get disproved, people don't give up their belief. They just start believing in those unknowns even more. And so it becomes like a central tenet of their faith. I can't be wrong. I'm not a fool, as long as that 26.9% of sightings still remains unknown. And that's why we keep going back to Roswell. Like I said, people who believe in conspiracy theories will always double down on the details and try to find inconsistencies and gaps. The fact that Roswell wasn't even a flying saucer sighting, it was basically a community trash pickup, that created all of this empty space that people could just fill up with crazy. So, like I said, nobody talked about it for 30 years, but then in 1980, a group of flying saucer researchers kind of discovered, hey, here's this empty space where we can come in and set up shop. So they started interviewing people who were in and around Roswell. They were talking mostly to elderly people about stuff that had happened 30 years in the past. Sometimes they were talking to people who were like the children of the folks who actually saw something, and so they're kind of telling tales about what they'd heard. Tons of inconsistencies, tons of gaps in everyone's memory. And so they could kind of put all this together and make up a story about a flying saucer gets struck by lightning, drops some debris in Roswell, and then crashes out in the desert. And this was picked up in 1980 for an episode of In Search Of, which is a popular paranormal TV show at the time. And they talked to Jesse Marcel, who kind of talked about how this wasn't a weather balloon, therefore it's aliens. And they didn't talk about actually alien bodies or finding that stuff out in the desert, because that hadn't been added to the story yet. That came in 1989 for an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. They talked to more people, and they found a whole bunch of people who could tell stories about being out in the New Mexico desert, seeing a crash, and then have military trucks coming up and collecting the alien bodies. Unsolved Mysteries also made a really big deal about the mysterious pink and purple hieroglyphics on the sticks. So in the early 90s, stories kept growing and growing, and a New Mexico congressman insisted that the Air Force just release all of their files about Roswell so everyone can know the truth. So they said, all right, you want it, here we go. And they published a 1,000-page book called The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. It's available just online for free. You can get a PDF. Seriously, I know it's 1,000 pages. It is so worth reading because it is hilarious. In the Roswell Report, the Air Force revealed for the first time that, Jesse Marcel was right. It wasn't a weather balloon. This was something else called Project Mogul, top secret project that was trying to detect signs of nuclear bomb testing from the Russians. Basically, it was, instead of one big balloon, it was these smaller balloons that went high up in the air carrying radar reflectors. And they were searching for the specific sound waves that would come and tell us that they're testing nuclear bombs. And nobody actually knew what they were working on because it was all compartmentalized. All the different pieces that were being constructed, those people had no idea what it was going to be. It was only the folks who were assembling the final product who actually knew what this was and what it was for. And the folks who worked on it talked about how weird it was for them to be working on this ultra top secret project, and then they just take it outside in broad daylight and just release it into the sky for everyone to see. Super stressful. And actually, They said that whenever they lost track of one of the balloons, they could find it just by following flying saucer reports. So this was one that they launched in early June, and then 10 days later, it crashes on the Roswell ranch, and then that's what Mac Brazel finds on June 12th. So that explains what that debris was. But what about all the stories about the military collecting bodies from a crash? There actually were a bunch of eyewitnesses that told kind of remarkably consistent stories. So where did that come from? This report explained that too. In the mid-50s, there was another program called Project Excelsior, which was testing out how to get pilots safely to the ground if they're ejecting at super high altitudes. So they used crash test dummies that then they would launch and they would fall. And so that was the thing we were doing. These days, everybody knows what a crash test dummy is, because there was a public service announcement in the 80s that kind of made them really popular, but they were just invented in the mid-50s. So folks in 1957 weren't familiar with the concept at all. So they see people across the desert, something crashes down, military trucks come up, circle it, collect what looks like human bodies or alien bodies, and loads it into the trucks and drives away. And that's why the aliens look the way that they do. That's why they're bald. They wear one-piece gray flight suits. And the crash test dummies had the fingers were not that sturdy, and so sometimes fingers would fall off. And so that's why the aliens from Roswell have 4 fingers on each hand. Now, it's still a little mysterious because the Project Mogul crash was 1947, and then Project Excelsior was 1957. But nobody asked about this stuff until the 1980s and really the 1990s. So at that point, folks are looking back 30 years, 40 years. There's tons of inconsistencies that allowed them to kind of fudge the dates and say this was all part of one event. And then there's the tape. I have to tell you about this tape. Like I said, Project Mogul, it was all compartmentalized. And the people who made some of the radar reflectors was a toy company in New York. And they didn't know what it was for. They used the materials that they had. And so the reflectors were held together with Elmer's glue and Scotch tape. And the tape was this novelty tape that had pink and purple flowers and hearts on it. So this is a rough sketch of what those symbols looked like. Spent a couple weeks in the air, spent a couple weeks on the ground, everything faded, and that is why Jesse Marcel got so excited about these hieroglyphics that were on these sticks. But honestly, people have been trying for decades to understand and decipher these mysterious hieroglyphics. After all this time, we are still trying to learn bee language. I wish I could say that we are all more sensible now we've learned our lessons, but in 2017, the New York Times reported that there was another Defense Department program studying flying saucers from 2007 to 2012, and that article implied that there was a warehouse that was full of alien metal that they'd collected from flying saucers, which I didn't really understand. Nobody really followed up on it, so I don't know what that was about. And then 2019, goddamn, pilots are still looking up. There was another report in 2019 that said that some Navy pilots had seen this mysterious tic-tac-shaped object that was flying around doing interesting things, and they weren't sure what's going on. There's a little film where they're looking at it and they're saying, what the hell is this? Flying saucer people got real excited about this, as obviously they would, but honestly, this is not advancing us any further than we were in 1953. It's still someone sees a thing. And I feel like we need to get together on this, you and me and the experienced pilots, and just agree among ourselves that we are not going to get excited about this until something actually happens. I feel that that's a reasonable request. So finally, that brings us to mistake number 4, which is, can all of these people be wrong? Over the decades, there are tons of sincere, credible people who said that they were eyewitnesses to something that was beyond this world. Can all of those people be wrong? And the answer is yes, of course they can. People are wrong 100% of the time. We're humans. We see what we want to see. We make up stories, and we live in those stories, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. So I think by now I have answered all of your questions about flying saucers except for one, which is, why am I so obsessed with this? People believe in silly things that aren't true. doesn't hurt anybody. Why am I so worried about it? And the answer is that I just don't want to be alone in the universe. There has got to be intelligent life out there that doesn't get their information about the world from the side of a U-Haul. So this is my transmission that I am sending out into the void. There has got to be somebody. Can anybody read me? Thank you very much. Over and out. Thank y'all so much.